Yeah. Afternoon, folks. Just about set and ready for the program today. It's going to be a really fun program. I think you'll enjoy it. We're going to spend some more time in the Ice Age today. And just fixing up a little tool here that got dinged up earlier today. So we're going to talk about Stone Age and Ice Age when we get going here shortly. But this is a bone, sort of a bone hand axe, I suppose you'd call it, but really a bone knife. And they're made by splintering out, breaking out pieces of bone. In this case, it's a camel bone. And they use a sharp edge on a piece of stone, and not a sharp edge like on a stone blade that's very narrow like we'd think of as a whittling knife, but something much steeper like that. And it actually scrapes a good deal of material without too much effort. And in coming weeks, we're going to be taking you through some programs that actually demonstrate and teach you how to do skills like that. We've got a whole series of experimental archaeology programs. If I remember right, next week's program is going to be cave painting, which is a very interesting and very important subject to the study of archaeology, and particularly Paleolithic peoples, because there's not a lot of stuff left behind from the Stone Age, even the more recent periods of the Stone Age. So I heard my 1 o'clock alarm go there, so we'll go ahead and get started. Looks like we've got a pretty good group of folks today. Thank you for joining us here again at Colossal Fossils on this lovely afternoon. Excuse me, if you haven't been to a previous program, my name is Sean. As you can see, I'm a fan of the Stone Age and the Ice Age. Get all dressed up for the occasion. Today's program, the Mammoth Hunter, well, it's all about us, in particular, our ancestors. Everything we're going to be talking about today, artifact-wise, technology-wise, lifestyle-wise, is essentially universal to Stone Age humans. Now, in the world today, there's places where technology is far advanced compared to other places, different cultures and different ways of doing things. But as recently as just a couple thousand years ago, technology was universal. The most high-tech thing in the world was a sharp rock. This is a 20,000-year-old piece of rock that was made into a stone knife. This was what we call a hafted knife. It would have actually had a handle on it, so sort of a caveman Bowie knife. But this type of tool was it. This was the space shuttle. This was the internet. This was top of the line tech. And that's true for every single one of us, wherever we're from, whoever our ancestors were. As recently as 5,000 years ago, everybody did it Stone Age style. And that goes back, well, for Homo sapiens, true human beings, about 320,000 years. Prior to that, we're looking at Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, which we're using similar but slightly less refined technologies, and that goes back at least 1.5 million years. So Stone Age technology, the stuff we're going to be looking at today, is really sort of the rule. Today's world is the exception throughout human existence. So as with previous programs, before I get going any further, there will be time for questions at the end. If you see something you want a closer look at or have any questions about what we talk about, of course, we'll make sure we have time for that. Now, without further ado, I would like to cover a couple of Well, misnomers and misconceptions. So first thing, the Stone Age. We call it the Stone Age because we find stone artifacts, rocks preserved very well in the archaeological record. But in fact, our ancestors, and indeed hunter-gatherer tribes, cultures throughout the world, right up into the current day, they don't just use stone tools. They use whatever is available. A lot of places these days, of course, that's metal. Uh, but during the Paleolithic, during the Stone Age, there would have been a lot of what we call osseous tools, things like this made out of bone, antler, even wood. As you can see, I've got a lot of decorations on here, a lot of jewelry. This is all shells, bones, antlers. Uh, you know, at home and the hut in process, I've even got some wolf's teeth that are being worked into jewelry. Most of this stuff doesn't survive. There are several instances where we found beads, we found jewelry. In one case, more than 4,000 beads in one burial site. The guy that was probably a chieftain or someone of high status was covered in beads. But most of the archaeological record doesn't show us these materials. We know they were being used, though. Now, the other misnomer, the Ice Age. Uh, well, the Ice Age was kind of like Wisconsin. It was cold most of the time, but it had warm spots. We like to think of the Ice Age as being this Arctic tundra, this vast wasteland of ice and snow, and no modern human could survive there. But in actual fact, the Ice Age wasn't all that different from the world today. It was colder. Glaciers, of course, had moved further south. So winter lasted longer. Where I am actually was under ice, under about 3/4 of a mile of glacier. Uh, so, Wisconsin itself had what we call the driftless zone, an area in the southwestern quarter of the state where the glaciers just didn't come down during the last ice age. But in any area like that, you would have summer, you would have warmer weather, you'd have spring and fall. Winter would be longer and colder, summer would be shorter and cooler, spring comes later, fall comes earlier, but you still have a change of seasons. You still have habitable area. The whole globe isn't a frozen wasteland. And of course, down by the equator, you still have tropical and subtropical jungles and all that wonderful stuff that we have today. Now, last but not least, cavemen. When we watch the movies, we see your typical caveman, your Stone Age hunter has himself a spear like so, and some kind of club, and that's his toolkit. That's what he goes hunting with. This is how he fights off, the saber-toothed cats and how he hunts the woolly mammoth. Well, they did have and use tools like that, of course, but they weren't how they hunted a woolly mammoth, and they certainly weren't primary tools in a lot of cases. Now, this, believe it or not, isn't even a club. This is a shovel. Now, sort of. It's not exactly a shovel like you want to go clear the sidewalk with after it snows. This is what we call a digging stick. The working end of this isn't the big knob. The working end is the point. And plant matter was a huge part of our ancestors' diet, just like it is today. If you just eat meat, well, after a couple of weeks to a month, you're going to start getting very sick. You have to have vitamins and nutrients, minerals that come from plants. Things like starches and carbohydrates are important to provide energy for a very high activity lifestyle. These are hunter-gatherers. They're going out every day, every other day, and searching the landscape over rough terrain. They're not riding bikes or hopping in the car and driving to the grocery store. Everything they do requires movement over a distance. They're going to eat a lot of food. Now this, we push into the ground next to the root or tuber, say a potato, and use the knob as a handle to lever up that tuber to break up the ground around it so we can pull it out. The only time this ever gets used as a club is if I find a potato on the side of a hill and it starts rolling away, and then potato pancake. As for the spear, this is a little bit more than 6 feet long. This particular one is tipped with an obsidian point. The obsidian is a lava glass. It's very, very sharp, up to, or rather down to, about 3 molecules thick on its cutting edge. It is sharper when freshly broken than a modern surgeon's scalpel. In fact, if Cave Wife wouldn't get upset with me when I got home, I could actually use this to shave off my beard, but we're not going to demonstrate that. Obsidian's a little bit brittle. There were lots of different stone types that were used. Some of them were chosen for their decorative qualities, like this, and some just for practical tool qualities. We're going to look in future programs specifically at flint knapping, and it's really interesting subject. It's a lot of fun. We're going to show you how some of these were made. Now this spear, though, this is not a mammoth hunting spear. If you remember back to our Ice Age program, Herbie, back behind me here, is a massive animal. He was 16 feet high. He weighed more than 5 tons. He could run at 35 miles an hour. And this spear, though it's 6 feet long, it's heavy. Of course, in the movies, they throw their spears, right? This spear weighs 3.5 pounds. The wood that it's made of is carved from a single piece of wood made from what we call a sucker, which is a growth off of a cut or fallen tree. So it was fairly long and straight and even to begin with. I just kind of smoothed and evened it out. But it's hard wood. It's heavy. For an idea of how much we're talking here, if you have a half gallon of milk, the skinny milk jug, and you pick that up, feel how heavy that is. That's just a little bit heavier than this. If you drink a cup or two of milk out of it, it'll be the same weight. Now, don't want anybody to actually try and throw a half-gallon jug of milk to see how far they can throw it. That phone call's really awkward, so please don't do that. But if I take this spear and I'm hunting a woolly mammoth back there and I throw this spear as hard as I can, it's going to go about 30 feet. A little bit farther than the length of your living room. And when it hits the ground or a bone, when I miss, this big piece of glass on the end is going to shatter. It's a one-time use thing if I throw it. Now, just to really drive this point home, I'm going to walk back there, stand in front of Herbie. It's really hard to tell on the 2D computer screen, but Herbie's about 30 feet away. And he is massive. Absolutely massive. Now, at 16 feet high, this animal is taller than a Tyrannosaurus Rex by about 4 feet. That's some of the height of some of you watching. Now, I can't throw this spear. So if I'm going to use this spear to hunt that mammoth, I have to run up to him and poke him. That presents a whole different set of problems. For one thing, this is a massive animal. To actually kill that animal for food, I have to hit an internal organ, a vital organ. Now to get this through the fur, even to the skin, is the depth of the spearhead. The skin then is 3 or 4 inches thick, in some places even thicker. Underneath the skin is a layer of insulating fat, and we're hunting these animals in the fall. We'll talk more about that in a minute. When that fat layer is at its thickest, then the muscle underneath the fat, then rib bones as big around as my arms. So if I grab this here, I am at the end of my spear. I have pushed that in that far, and I haven't yet hit an internal organ that's going to actually bring that animal down. I am close enough to touch it. That means that I have a 5-ton plus, 16-foot tall very, very angry mammoth, I'm close enough to touch it. It's not where you want to be as a hunter. In fact, its next step, because I've basically at this point just given it a really long, sharp splinter and annoyed it, is going to be, I'm going to be about that tall, really squishy, and not bringing steaks home to anybody back at the village. Now, if I'm really lucky, instead of stomping on me, he'll just take those 11-foot-long tusks, swing his head to the side, and I'll end up 30 feet up in a tree over there, broken up and pretty sore, but not dead, still not bringing food home to anybody. Now, sometime a very long time ago, our ancestors realized if we lighten those spears up a little bit, we can throw them better. This is a javelin, a much lighter spear. If I throw this one, I can throw it about the length of the museum. So we're talking around 60 feet. Now, Olympian javelin throwers, of course, can throw them much farther, and our ancestors probably could too, because they practiced with these much more than I do. Other than being much lighter weight, it's the same materials, it's built the same way, just smaller and lighter. But somewhere around probably 60 to 65,000 years ago, we don't know exactly when, our ancestors invented the ultimate mammoth hunting tool. Looks like this. Now, this doesn't look like much of a spear, I know, and that's because it's not the spear. This is what we call an atlatl. Now, this particular one has some weights on it. At its most basic, it is a stick about the length of my arm with a hook on the end. And that hook allows me to use it with a dart. This is just a spear, kind of halfway between a spear and an arrow. The back of it has a notch like an arrow. It's got fletchings on it like an arrow. And we have dozens and dozens of cave paintings that show fletched spears. This one is tipped with an antler point, but it could be antler, bone, stone, even hard wood. All different kinds of points exist for these. The hook on the atlatl meets up with the notch on the end so that it holds in place. I hold the spear around the thrower like so to hold it tight in place. Now, when I go to throw this, I get about halfway through my throw to right about here. I let go of the spear with the fingers that I'm holding it up to the thrower with, and I give it a flick of the wrist. Kind of like casting a fishing pole, very much like casting a fishing pole. And that allows me to throw this spear more than 100 yards. That's the length of a football field plus, and with enough force to actually put a spear through a door. But we're not going to go into how I know that specifically. Let's just say Cave Wife told me to play outside. Now, with a tool like that, our ancestors can hunt the largest game on the landscape. Now, a mammoth hunt is a big event. I'm not doing this by myself. Remember, this is a huge animal. Huge animal means a lot of food. In fact, one mammoth would probably be enough to feed a village for the better part of a winter. You're talking literally tons of meat. All of the meat that we like to eat today. Mammoth steaks, mammoth barbecue ribs, mammoth chicken wings, mammoth chicken nuggets, mammoth fish sticks, mammoth beef jerky, you know, any variety of meat that we have today, you could essentially get the same thing out of a mammoth that you get from a cow or a pig or any other equivalent critter. But there's a couple of problems. So today we go to the grocery store, we buy a bunch of meat, say we get a big, huge roast for holiday season or a Thanksgiving turkey, we take it home and put it in the fridge. During the Stone Age, of course, no one has a fridge. Electricity hasn't even been conceived of as something we can use yet. You know, lightning is still magic. It's something that happens in the sky when the creator, the gods are angry or that sort of thing. It's not something that we understand. So if we have 3-4 tons of meat, but we have to keep it cold, we have to preserve it somehow. So we hunt a mammoth in the fall, actually right about this time of year. Now, this time of year has several advantages for that. One, the whole world is our walk-in freezer. It's cold outside, so we can preserve that meat and keep that food all winter long. It allows us more time to process that meat and make it into, say, jerky and steaks, things that we can feed everybody with. And well, this animal has been grazing all summer long. It has put on fat all summer long with the intention of surviving through the winter when pickings are scarce. Very much like modern day bison and deer, elk, and so on do today. And so this time of year, the mammoth is at its largest, its juiciest, tenderest, and most nutritious. This is when we hunt the mammoth. Now, hunting a woolly mammoth, as I said, it is a big event. You know, this is going to be something that we tell stories about. You know, we get several hunters together, maybe a dozen or up to a dozen and a half hunters. We leave the village and wander the Ice Age landscape. Now, mammoths have to eat a half ton plus every day. That means these animals do not stand still. They are constantly walking and eating. So, well, our village is going to be set up in a good spot, place with river, shelter, available food for the summer season. But when we go to hunt for the mammoth, we have to go a distance. So the hunters are going to come together, their spears and atlatls, their equipment, their gear ready to go, and they're going to take off looking for the mammoth herds. Of course, from previous years, they're going to have an idea of where they should be, but they still have to go look for them. They might have to walk 75 or 100 miles to find that herd because it's constantly moving. It's not necessarily in the same place it was last year. But when they finally find that herd, they take their atlatls, they sneak up to within 100 yards or so, and they throw their spears in a volley. We see a volley in medieval war movies where the archers shoot their arrows up in an arch and they rain down over the castle walls. When we find mammoth skeletons that have been hunted with atlatls and hunted in this way, it's pretty normal to find spears that are coming down, coming in on a downward angle when they hit, say, a rib bone or a vertebra, that sort of thing. So we know for at least a good portion of the hunt, they're keeping their distance. They don't want to get stepped on. Now, once there's a spear in that animal, we're tracking it. We're throwing the spears at the same animal. Once it starts to move off, we're following that animal. That is our dinner. However long it takes, that's what we're going after. We don't just keep throwing spears until one gets lucky and falls. Once we've hit that animal, we're after it. Now, depending on how it was hit and what kind of spears and the size of the animal and so on, it could take a couple of days even of tracking and following and throwing a couple more spears at it to try and bring that animal down, because they are very large, very powerful animals. But eventually that animal will come down and we have a whole new set of problems. Now we know that mammoths were on the menu. Our woolly mammoth here, in fact, the he-beer mammoth from Kenosha, call him Herbie because he-beer is a little bit of a tongue twister for the youngins. Herbie was hunted and eaten by the first Wisconsinites 14,800 years ago, at least the first Wisconsinites we know of. At the site, we got 80% of his skeleton, and several of the bones showed tool marks, which is to say scratches on the bone from when it was being processed out. They were taking the meat off of the bone. And we even found a couple of stone tools. No fancy blades, but stuff like this. And these were either being used to sharpen tools like this, or for what we'll talk about more in the flint knapping program called blade and core, where they knock off long, thin, sharp flakes to use them as knives. Now, because we have that mammoth, we have a few problems right away. Once that mammoth is down on the ground, the hunters come up and we've got tons of food, right? One of the first things they do, in fact, is get something to eat because the hunters, well, they've been chasing this thing for 100 miles, maybe 150 miles, right? We could be as far as 200 miles away from the village and more than a week gone by. So of course they've been eating on the way, but this is food and it's fresh food. So they're going to start some fires. They're going to have a bite to eat. But even if there's, say, 18 of me, a dozen and a half hunters, big, strong hunters, we're not going to pick up a 5-ton woolly mammoth and carry it 200 miles back to the village. So we've got a lot of food over here and a lot of villagers over here and a problem in between. So what happens is this. A couple of the hunters are going to leave most of their gear. They're going to grab their spear and a canteen and some really light gear, and they're going to start running back to the village after lunch. It might take them 4 or 5 days to get back there. The fastest distance runners in the world can cover 40 to 50 miles in a day over rough terrain. And these guys, they were physically fit. They were running every day just as part of life because they can't hop in the car and drive to where they want to go. So if you want to get to someplace in a hurry, you jog there. But it's still going to take them most of a week to get back to the village. Now, when they get back to the village, of course, they're going to tell everybody, we have food. The hunt was a success. The whole village is going to pack up absolutely everything, from tools to toys, tents to toddlers, old and young. Everybody is going to pack up everything they have, throw it into backpacks, what we call tump lines, which are sort of a single strap backpack, or travois, which is a platform where you put a bunch of stuff on and you grab it like wheelbarrow handles and then drag it because they don't have wheels yet. They don't have dogs that can carry backpacks full of stuff. They don't have horses like the Native Americans. They have to carry everything. And they start making their way back to where that mammoth is. Now, that's going to take them longer than it took the joggers to get to them. It could be a week and a half or 2 weeks before they make that distance. In the meantime, the rest of the hunters, the dozen or so men that have stayed behind with that mammoth, they have a couple of problems. First things first, of course, they have to start making that mammoth into meat. So they're going to be using these stone tools. This particular one was actually found with a mastodon. And so they're using tools like this to make steaks, to make jerky. While they're doing that, they have to be very careful. That's actually where these big spears, this big, heavy, sharp spear comes into play. Now remember, this isn't a spear that I throw. It's heavy. It weighs about 3 pounds. This is what we call a lance. It's a thrusting spear. Well, most of the hunters are working on butchering that mammoth, making it into meat. Several of the hunters are going to be standing here like this, watching out over the mammoth steppe, over the open plains, the prairies. And they're watching for predators. Remember, all of the predators from our Ice Age program, Ice Age Giants, we have cougars, wolves, and black bears, just like today, coyotes and wolverines. But we also have American lions, saber-toothed cats, hyenas. We have grizzly bears. We have giant short-faced bears. We have massive predators. The giant short-faced bear on all fours stands 6 feet tall. When it rears up on its hind legs, it's almost as tall as a T-Rex at about 12 feet high. It weighs more than 2,000 pounds. And every one of these animals smells that meat. Think if you go camping, how you have to secure your food at night so the raccoons don't take it, kind of like that, but on a massive scale. So we're standing guard with our spears. And we're keeping an eye out for any of these predators that want to come in and take the mammoth from us. And when we see that, say one of those bears galloping its way across the plains coming to take our meat, we tell the other hunters and they all grab their spears and we stand at the ready. This is the spear that you wave in the face of the bear and say, "Go away, bear, please don't eat me." We know that interactions like that actually happen because, believe it or not, they show up in cave art. Actually, one of the little pictures I added to my own portable cave art here, the hunter's facing off with a bear. There is a particularly neat little bone artifact that has an etching, an engraving in it, and it's not complete. It was broken into a couple of pieces and the rest of the picture was lost, but it shows some poor fellow on his back like this with his spear at his side and the claws and snout of a bear on the edge of the broken portion, leaning over him menacingly. Because of the artifact being broken and partially lost, we don't know how the story ended, but I'm going to guess that hunter had a really bad day. Now, personally, I wouldn't want to face down a bear with nothing but a spear. Now, the other thing that our hunters that have stayed behind with the mammoth have to do, because they need light at night. Just like now, the days are getting shorter, nights are getting longer. They need light to work. They need heat. It's cold outside. They need to cook their food, and they need to protect it, particularly at night. As many of these predators, like the big cats, for example, tend to be nocturnal. We don't see very well at night, so they need fire. Fire is one of the most important, I guess we'll call it inventions of humanity. Early on, we think that people sort of collected fire from natural sources and kept it going. Eventually, of course, we learned how to make it. Sort of the typical Stone Age idea of how to make fire is what we call fire by friction. Unfortunately, it's very hard for me to demonstrate on camera with the setup that we have for today, but we'll be talking a lot about starting fires in the future. The basic concept is that you have a spindle that you spin by hand in a divot on the hearth board. We have a notch here that catches the dust and ash that you form from rubbing those two pieces of wood together. And if you got everything set up right, your materials are very dry, your technique is good, you get about a quarter-sized pile of what we call punk, which is burnt sawdust. And that point of friction, that point of contact gets up to 850 degrees, and it ignites into an ember. Now around here, they weren't doing it this way. This tends to be a desert technique because these materials have to be very dry. Around here, they're doing something very similar, but with what we call a bow drill kit. Same kind of hearth board, but they're using a cordage wrapped around a piece of, wrapped around their spindle with a bow like this. Of course, this one's not very tight because it's not set up right now, but they would hold it down on the hearth board and spin the bow or move the bow back and forth. That spins the spindle and it lights the fire. Typically, I can get a fire going with a bow drill in about 1 minute. Now, with a hand drill, it can take me as much as 5 to build up enough friction and get that all working. Now, in Ice Age Europe, unfortunately, this stone isn't available here, but in Ice Age Europe, our ancestors discovered something really, really cool. And we actually think Neanderthal was using this technology as well. This is a very special rock called marcasite. It's iron sulfide. If we break these open, they're metal, naturally occurring iron. They have sort of a starburst crystalline look to them. They're very pretty stones. But if I take that stone and a flint flake and I strike them together, it will spark. Now, They're very faint, very dim sparks. You have to have a very specific kind of tinder to light with them. They were using stuff like this. This is what we call chaga, or tinder fungus. It grows on a birch tree. The outside of it is kind of this gnarly black lump, but if you break it open, it's orange and almost styrofoamy. And it is full of oil from the birch bark that it's feeding on. And those sparks will actually ignite an ember. If you have material like this, plant fiber, think like cotton ball fluff, really fine, almost hair-like fibers from plants, nice and dry. You can take that ember and use it to light a fire. Now, because the marcasite sparks are so dim, they're very difficult to see on the camera. So I would like to demonstrate what this looks like with a more refined, much more recent historical example. This is what we call a fire steel or a strike-a-light. The typical flint and steel from the 1750s to early 1800s in the Great Lakes area, right around here. These would have actually been trade goods during the fur trade. This is mine that I use for camping trips, and it's the same exact process as the marcasite. It just has, because it's been melted and hammered and built into a tool, all of the impurities have been worked out, so it gives a much brighter, more visible spark. So here we go. I think that showed up okay on the camera. I hope everybody could see it. Now, the sparking that this rock, this marcasite does, is the same thing. It's just not as bright to the camera. If I do this, I can see the sparks coming off of it. I can smell it. It actually smells like a struck match, but I don't know if it shows up at all. Doesn't look like it. But anyhow, fire is one of the top 3 most important inventions that our ancestors developed. The cutting edge stone tools, because we don't have strong teeth and claws. Fire gives us light, warmth, lets us cook our food and preserve it. Can use it actually as a tool to cut, to shape, to build, to harden, to melt. And believe it or not, string, thread, the ability to bind things together, to sew clothing, even boats, tents, so on. Those are the top 3 most important things that we have ever invented. Those 3 technologies actually lead us from the very beginning of the Stone Age up to things like the space shuttle and the computer that we're talking over right now. Now, once our hunters have their fire made and they're hanging up racks of thin cut strips of meat over the fire to smoke and dry, they're cooking steaks, they're eating the liver and the organs, all of the fresh meat, they're getting well fed because the first people there eat the first cuts of meat. They're waiting and protecting their hunt. And eventually, probably a week and a half to 2 weeks later, everybody else shows up. By the time they're there, we have piles of frozen steaks because it's cold outside, it's icy, it's snowy, and they're preserving that meat. We have racks and racks of jerky, the hide from the mammoth, the ribs, some of the tusks have been pulled out to dry, have been cleaned up. That will actually be built into a tent. We have Paleolithic sites where mammoth tusks and ribs were used as tent poles, and we believe they were stretching the hide itself over that to use the mammoth itself as a hut, as a shelter. The Hebrew site, we don't see evidence of that. We actually have the skeleton mostly left there, and we think the meat was taken away. He probably fell into an uncomfortable spot to sleep, like a marshy setting. But we have several sites where they were actually using the mammoth itself as a shelter. Now, once the village gets to the mammoth site, everybody, they haven't seen each other for weeks. Everybody's hungry. They now have fire, they have shelter, they have their families back together. It's time to celebrate. They have a feast, a party. Everybody eats their fill of meat. They have food for the winter. Everybody's safe. The hunt was successful. They're warm and dry and fed. And at this time, those are all very important, just like they are today. Now, there's a couple of things that happen at this point because our hunters, they don't have to hunt for quite a while. They can relax. The rest of the village, they have food. They don't have to worry about what they're going to eat the next day. All they really have to do is collect firewood, keep the hut clean, and chill. And because of that, they start doing some neat things. Around 40,000 years ago, we start seeing evidence of some really awesome stuff that we still do today. For example, and we know this goes back further, but we start to get really good examples of it, artwork. We start to see more and more detailed cave paintings, in some places even symbols and things that we're not sure quite what they meant. In some places, the cave paintings get so detailed, we can actually see specific individual animals with the same pattern that show up in different paintings, almost like a progression, like a story. And the Paleolithic art can tell us a lot about the people who are actually painting it. In one instance, there's a pair of handprints of a toddler or a very young child. They're very small, but they're about 6.5 feet up the cave wall. And we think that somebody had, a little cave kid, and a little cave kid put their hands in the paint. They picked them up and held them up, and they went and left their handprints 6 feet up, way up top of the cave wall. Stuff like that. Now, of course, jewelry, decoration. Around 35,000 years ago, we start to see what we call Venus figurines. Like this one here. This is Cave Wife. Cave Wife is carved out of ivory. Now, this is ancient mineralized ivory. It's actually from a walrus tusk. It's not modern and was not hunted. But we find stuff like that out of ivory, bone, limestone. They were making things into decoration to show off, to distinguish themselves from one another. And of course, my personal favorite, something we still all use today, they started making music. Now, if you're going to have a we get to eat all winter long party, you're going to want to turn on the stereo. But they didn't have stereos, radios, CD players. Of course, they had to make their own music. This is a chicken bone, actually a chicken leg bone. It was barbecue. It was delicious. And after I was done, I cleaned this bone up and I made it into a whistle based on some Paleolithic examples, the oldest of which is 42,000 years old. Not too bad for a chicken leg, huh? Now, we actually have full-sized examples of those flutes. Now, this one's made out of bamboo. The full-sized ones made out of the wing bones of animals like swans and vultures. In one case, somebody spent more than 200 hours carving one out of a solid piece of mammoth tusk. What's really neat when we make a replica like this, where the finger holes are in the placements and to the size of the original, we find they're using the same musical notes that we still use today. So you can imagine a couple of bone flutes being sort of the lead in the Mammoth Hunter band. Of course, they had several kinds of instruments that we think of today. In this case, a rattle made of deer hooves. These would have been popular because every time you get a deer, you get enough to make a rattle. Drums. Now, this particular drum is made of rawhide. And that's dried, untanned leather stretched over the frame. It's got a pretty good sound to it. And though it's fairly fragile, you'd have to be careful with it traveling. It's very light. It's very portable. So this can give you the basis to your Stone Age band. Now, these we probably recognize more from like Vikings, that sort of thing. But horns made either of giant shells, even hollow wood, like the didgeridoo, or in this case, cow and oxen horns, show up in multiple places, many cultures all across the world. Now, where all of this gets made, what I'm doing is what we call experimental archaeology. And the experimental is an important part of that because sometimes a thing doesn't work. Well, this I'd like to demonstrate very quickly here. This is an experiment that didn't quite work. Now, Cave Wife calls this the fart horn. I did a couple of things wrong with it. It's not supposed to sound like that. So to make this into a horn, I actually had to cut the end of the horn off. The inside is naturally hollow, and I used a stone-tipped drill, very much like a short arrow without any feathers on it. I use it with that bow drill, where I spin it back and forth as I push down. Then it took around 5 hours, 6 hours to drill that hole out to make a sound with this. Well, as it turned out, when I cut the end off, I cut it too short. So it doesn't reverberate. It doesn't make a very good sound like it's supposed to. So I went back to the drawing board. I made a larger one. Now this one, I didn't clean it up on the outside nearly as much before I set to working on it. I kind of reversed my process. So I've only got about 6 hours into this as opposed to the 25 plus on the other one. This one has a really good sound. Now, I'm going to step back a bit because I don't want to surprise everybody here with the speaker or the microphone being so close, but we'll give this one a shot. This is our Mammoth calling trumpet. Hopefully that didn't provide a lot of feedback in the speakers, but something like this could not only be used to signal to other groups, to other hunters, to help the village find you by calling back and forth. And I've used this out in the real world. That sound, when done a little bit louder than it is inside here, carries more than a quarter mile, which is quite a distance through rough outdoor terrain like woods and such. If you got up on a hilltop, you could probably hear this for several miles in any direction, at least enough to recognize it as something that was being made by a person. If you drill a couple of holes in a longer one, or you change your tone that you're making with your buzzing your lips, like Australian Aborigines do with didgeridoo, you can actually use that as a musical instrument. You can make different tones. Now this, sort of a lesser known Stone Age instrument, and it's most famous, most well known for its presence in Australian Aborigine culture, but it shows up all over the world, North and South America, Africa, even Europe, as recently as the Middle Ages. We call this a bull roarer. Now, a couple of things about this real quick. This is sort of a halfway between the Stone Age version of a bass guitar and a drum line or like a synthesizer. The way this works, I swing this paddle around on the string. As it's swinging around, the paddle spins. It's shaped like an airplane wing. As it's spinning, it vibrates that string and it makes a tone, very much like the string of a guitar. Important detail, if you use a piece of string like this that is twined, that's twisted, one way it twists really tight, works great, gives you a great sound. The other way, it untwists and unravels. Now you'll hear when I demonstrate this in a moment that as it's spinning, it pauses the sound every so often. That means it's spun as far as it can one direction and it starts twisting the other direction. So if you have that string that you can untwist, well, this part flies across the living room, breaks a lamp, and Cave Wife tells me I have to play outside. So this is very much an outdoor musical instrument. Because of that, being in the museum, surrounded by mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths, I can't demonstrate this one. But for the occasion, I put together an inside model. I'm going to demonstrate. This is called the Noisy Cricket. And the little cricket there is actually an engraving copied from a cave painting. Somebody back in the Paleolithic, 25,000 years ago, was painting pictures of the crickets that they saw in their cave. Now, everybody's ready. Give this a spin. All right, I hope the sound came through on that all right. The only difference between this one and the larger one is the larger one makes a much deeper tone. The largest, you can almost feel it as much as hear it. And the tone lasts longer because the longer string takes more time to twist as far as it can before it starts spinning back the other way. Now, if you want to look these up, these are called bull roarer. And they're really very easy to make. But like I said, it's an outdoor musical instrument. Definitely backyard. Watch out for neighbor kids, cats, dogs, mom and dad, cars in the street, that sort of thing. And you want to use a type of string that's either braided or a solid strip of leather that's very strong so that it won't snap and it won't untwist itself as you use it. Yes, true story. Broken lamp, not fun. Now, I heard my little beep go there. Does anybody have any questions about what we've talked about so far or want a closer look at something? Or yeah, go ahead.
How did they get the stone tools?
Well, they actually made them. So if I step back here, the process is kind of interesting. It's very complicated, but very simple at the same time. So this is a piece of rock. This particular one's called basalt. I use this for a lot of stone tools for rough stone work. They'd find a rock like this and have another type of rock. Like this here is a piece of granite river cobble. It's a very hard stone. And they'd literally just break off a piece as the basis for their tool. There we go. Now, that is essentially a very simple stone tool. That's got a very sharp edge on it, and I can use that as a cutting tool. Now, for our flint knapping program that comes up, I believe 2 weeks from now, we'll actually be taking a piece like this, a flake called a spall, and I'll be showing you how to break it down into a tool. The process is fairly simple, but there's some important tricks to it. And they basically take a piece of stone like this, broken off of a big chunk, and hit it with another rock, an antler, whatever sort of tool they're using, anywhere from 100 to a couple thousand times, just exactly the right way to form it into something like this. Each and every one of the marks on this, what we call flake scars, and they're the mark that's left over on the rock from a flake of stone being broken off by an impact. Now, the right kind of stone, good stone to make tools out of, was highly sought after, was hard to find, and in places where it wasn't readily available, they would trade for it, trade things, all kinds of things. Like the Native Americans here in Wisconsin would trade with other tribes further south for good stone. They'd trade things like cranberries and maple syrup that grow up north or that we can get here that those tribes couldn't get down in, say, Missouri or Southern Illinois. And they'd go up and down the Mississippi River and trade them back and forth. Things like that were happening for tens of thousands of years all across the world because tool stone is hard to come by.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Did you have any other questions? All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, oh, there we go. Go ahead.
What's that big bear thing over there?
This right here, or oh, the right behind me? Right here.
Nah, not that. The thing over there.
Above his head.
Oh,
Yeah.
This guy. That's the giant ground sloth. That's Sid. I was gonna say, Sid is our Megatherium. This is a North American Ice Age animal. If you've seen the Ice Age movies, Sid is a giant ground sloth. The actual animal is a lot more impressive than the one in the Ice Age cartoon. Megatherium here could stand almost as tall as a giraffe, weigh up to 4 tons. And we've got him set up here with our Ice Age critters just to show how massive an animal he is. Our early North American ancestors, our Stone Age hunters, would have actually eaten Megatherium. They would be on the menu. Other than humans, saber-toothed cats, maybe an occasional short-faced bear would be the only animals that would be capable of hunting and taking down an animal like a Megatherium. But they're very closely related to the modern day sloths, 2-toed and 3-toed sloths. But they're too big to climb in trees, so they live on the ground. Thank you. So, all right, it looks like we got time for one more question. If anybody's got any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Bye.
Well, if that's it for questions, that's all right. So next week, like I said, I believe our program is going to be cave painting. And we're actually going to take a look at some real Paleolithic cave art.
Bye.
Talk about that. And we're going to
Bye.
make your own paints.
Bye-bye.
All right. We'll see everybody next week. Thank you for joining me here for the program today.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you. Bye. Bye.